Hi, I'm Dave Maynard, and this is the second week of the course, How Christianity Changed the World. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of things this week, but we're going to start out with charity and compassion. And this is going to sound kind of strange, but did compassion always exist in the ancient world? Or was there something always like the Salvation Army? Again, we need to transfer ourselves back to the Greco-Roman culture. This will be hard because we grew up, or we have grown up, in a Christian culture. Human compassion, believe it or not, among the ancients was very rare. Back then, about 95% of the people were poor, and only about 5% were rich. There really wasn't much of a middle class. But in America, about 20% are rich, 70% are middle class, and about 10% are poor. And even the poor in America, due to our social safety nets, are considered almost rich in other countries. Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher, said that a poor man, usually a slave, who was no longer able to work because of sickness, should be left to die. Ouch. The Roman philosopher Plautus said that you do a beggar bad service by giving him food and drink. You lose what you have, and you prolong his life for more misery. Remember that Roman spectators took great delight in seeing gladiators mauled or stabbed to death in the arenas, a practice that took place for over 600 years. That's almost 3 times as long as America has existed. In essence, the Greco-Roman culture didn't see the hungry, the sick, the dying, or slaves as worthy of human assistance. They saw helping them as a weakness. Now remember, slavery had been practiced throughout the world until the influence of Christianity stopped it, and we'll talk more about that a little later. But when plagues hit an area, for example, people fled. Such behavior prompted the Roman Emperor Julian to lament that the Christians, whom he detested, showed more love and compassion than his pagan countrymen did. Now, the Eastern cultures, China, Japan, things like that, they resembled the Greco-Roman world in this regard. In its extreme form, these cultures could easily practice human sacrifice, especially in the land of Canaan. Into this callous, compassionless culture, Christians entered. And they entered it partly because of what Matthew says in Matthew chapter 25, verses 35, where he says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And then down in verse 45, he said, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of these, you did for me." But also to the people who didn't do this, he said, "Whatever you did not do for one of these, you didn't do for me." Also in John chapter 15, verse 13, Jesus says this, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend." So no, there wasn't a lot of compassion in the ancient world. I wish when we had studied history back in high school and even college, they had talked about things like this, but they didn't. So another area is charity to orphans. Again, believe it or not, child abandonment was common in the ancient world. And again, we're going to talk more about that a little later. Also, many parents died while their children were still young. Now, the early Roman Church, for example, was not very rich because they regularly took in abandoned and homeless children. They took them into their homes and they raised them as their own. In fact, this is why they required godparents when their children were baptized, because in case they died, the godparents would then take over and raise the children themselves as their own. Much later, Christians established orphanages for homeless children. Now, they only did this when Christianity became legal. I've got a whole list here of orphanages. I just printed this off on the internet, and it is absolutely amazing. There are several pages here, and you can see most of them have Christian names to them, like Abba Father's House in Uganda, or the Friends Orphanage Mission, City of Refuge Orphanage, Seeds of Hope Academy. It goes on and on and on. And again, Christians were the first ones to establish these orphanages. No other culture or religion did this. Christians did it because they saw the biblical teachings that said every human life was precious in the sight of God. In fact, in some orphanages in India, in one orphanage in particular, believe it or not, this was in northern India when my wife and son went there, probably 15 years ago. They were taking in homeless and abandoned children, and the locals actually, when the Hindu National Party came to power, they actually cordoned off the orphanage and they wouldn't let supplies in. And the reason was because they said, you're messing with this whole area's karma. These kids are homeless for a reason. They were schmuck in another life, basically. They didn't use the word schmuck, I did, but they said they're getting payback for what they did in another life, and you're preventing that. And so that'll fall back on the rest of us. It was only the intervention of the national government that realized that this orphanage had started schools. They had taken in, now I think it's over 2,000 children. They even established a seminary. They were taking care of these kids. But according to the Hindu religion, they were messing with the area's karma. So another area is the charity to the aged. Now, there is no historical evidence of homes for the aged in the years preceding Christianity. None. Christians established homes for the aged by the 5th century. Again, it took them until the 4th century for Christianity even to become legal. Before that, many Christians just took aged people into their homes and they cared for them. Now, some cultures, especially in the East, did esteem their elders, but it didn't translate into caring for them when they were old and frail and alone. For example, the Eskimos used to practice letting their aged slowly freeze to death. Wow. Another area is charity by American voluntary associations. In the 1940s, a guy named Gunnar Meider, who was a foreign observer, said this about Americans: no country has so many cheerful givers as America. In fact, he attributed this to the influence of the churches. Now, even the following organizations have largely been influenced by Christians or Christian churches. And I'm not saying they're Christian at their core, but they grew up in an environment of Christianity. And some of them are Christian at their core, like the Lutheran Brotherhood, like the Ukrainian National Association, but even service clubs like Kiwanis, the Lions, the Optimist, the Rotary. Those were all started within a Christian culture. They did not start in countries without a significant Christian influence. You've got the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association. You have soup kitchens, daycare centers, rescue missions. Even within local churches, you have divorce care groups. Alcoholics Anonymous was started by a couple of Christians. Habitat for Humanity. A lot of food pantries are related to churches. You have clothing and shoe ministries, mobile food pantries, things like that, helping people in finding jobs, things like that. So Christianity has always practiced these things. And really, it's not until maybe the 20th century that governments began to get into this. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little about child labor laws. One of the major tragedies of the Industrial Revolution was child labor exploitation. Little kids, 7, 8, 9 years old, were working 12, 16 hours a day in sweatshops. The people who greatly influenced the governments to outlaw child labor, especially in the British Empire, were English Christians like William Wilberforce, Charles Dickens, Thomas Carlyle, Lord Shaftesbury. While child labor has been effectively outlawed in Christian Western countries, it's still widespread in many non-Christian countries or non-Western countries today. Countries like China, Thailand, Bangladesh, Africa, things like that. In 1997, UNICEF estimated there are 2 to 4 million children who are working in what amounts to child sweatshops in Mexico's economy, and Mexico is nominally Catholic. Obviously, they're not practicing it very much, but so people who think that human charity and compassion existed just as a result of civilization, without the impetus and influence of Christianity, are just plain misinformed. George Grant says that as missionaries circled the globe, they started hospitals, founded orphanages, started rescue missions, opened soup kitchens, incorporated charitable societies, and they changed laws. They made it seem like lives of people mattered. Sympathy toward the poor is a concept that comes from Christianity because the rich and elite of the ancient world despised them. In ancient times, if you were sick, could you go to a doctor or a hospital? You might be surprised to know, no, you couldn't. The Greco-Roman world had a colossal void when it came to caring for the sick and the dying. Now, because God loves everybody, John 3:16 says that, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Because of that, Christians have felt we can't please God unless we love one another. In John chapter 15, verses 12 and 13, it says this: "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." The early Christians rejected the inhumane treatment of the sick and the dying. They saw each person as having a redeemable soul, and so, because of that, they needed to nurse and nurture each and every person, regardless of their physical condition or social standing. Saving physically frail people was an affront to the Greco-Roman culture. It violated their cultural norms. Seneca, a first-century Roman philosopher, said, "We drown children who at birth are weakly and abnormal." Wow. Now, yes, Greeks and Romans and others did have doctors, but they were usually only for the rich and elite, and sometimes for the higher-ranking military officers. Doctors and hospitals for everybody else didn't exist until Christians established them. Nearly 400 years after Christians began building hospitals, and we didn't start doing that till maybe around the 5th century. Again, once Christianity became legalized, then we could do stuff like that. But 400 years after that, the Arabs noticed the humanitarian work of these Christian hospitals, and then they began to build them in their countries. Almost all of the early American hospitals were started by Christians or churches. And this is still true in countries like India today. In fact, it's still true in a lot of America. Many of the hospitals were started by Christian or Christian organizations, especially in the South. Nursing as a profession was started by Florence Nightingale, and she was a Christian who was greatly influenced by a Christian doctor and his nurse that had serviced her when she was younger. The Red Cross was started by Jean-Henri Durant, who could say at the end of his life, "I am a disciple of Christ as in the first century and nothing more." Again, because the Arab world saw the effect of the Red Cross, they started their own. They just didn't include the Christian stuff, and that's what the Red Crescent is. It's an astonishing mystery that the Greeks and the Romans, who built these large temples in honor of their gods and goddesses, they fashioned statutes of all sorts. They wrote a wide variety of literatures. They built huge arenas, aqueducts. They built great roads. They never built any churches for the regular people. Wow. The American church historian Philip Schaff has said, "The old Roman world was a world without charity." Okay, let's move on now to the subject of liberty and justice for all. And here we're going to focus just on American liberty, basically because I think it's been so misunderstood and we only have a limited time here. From the U.S. Supreme Court Holy Trinity case in 1892, the Supreme Court justices said this: "This is true from the discovery of this continent to the present hour. These and many others add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation." End quote. Wow. That's amazing. We have a handout here on liberty and justice, and it talks about a lot of the first that Christianity actually did, and you can see that. We also have, there also is a paper on a lot of the influential thinkers who influenced our founding fathers. For example, Montesquieu, a Frenchman, wrote about the separation of church and state, and I'm sorry, not the separation of powers. In other words, what we know as the checks and the balances. We think he did this based on Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, which says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" And we think that's one of the reasons he said you shouldn't give too much power to any one person or one group, because they're going to abuse it. And so you need to have these checks and balances. You know, some people have said, well, the Constitution doesn't mention God at all. So where do you get off saying we were a Christian nation? And what do you mean by that? And we'll go into that later. But the Constitution shouldn't say anything about God, because it's like an owner's manual. It tells you how to operate government. It sets up the bylaws. It's like an auto repair manual for a car. That's not going to tell you why the car was invented or all the benefits of a car. It's just going to tell you how to run the car. The Declaration of Independence is our founding document, not the Constitution. And it's the Declaration that gives us the reason for that freedom. And it's in the Declaration where the Christian influence is most directly seen. God is mentioned throughout the Declaration, especially in the first part of it. Our founders believed that Christianity produced the public morality without which civil government could not long survive. And on this basis, They neither created nor tolerated anything that would have diminished Christianity's effects on the people. Now, I'm not talking about denominations here. In England, they basically said, if you're a Christian, you're going to be an Anglican, whether you like it or not. Here in America, we said, no, no, no. Yes, Christianity was the favored religion by a long shot, but they didn't tell people, you got to be an Anglican, you got to be a Catholic, you got to be a Methodist. In fact, the whole meaning of the First Amendment means that. It means that government will not tell you who you're going to worship or how you're going to worship them or anything like that. It's meant to prevent us from becoming like England. States were free to have their own state-supported religions, but the federal government wasn't. In fact, after the Constitution was enacted, all of the states had their own state-supported denominations, and they didn't see that as being in conflict with the First Amendment. John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the second President of the United States, saw the American government as, quote, grounded on reason, morality, and the Christian religion, end quote. Now, this is a whole big issue, and again, I wish we had more time to delve into it, but I'm going to give you some references for it. But to skeptics of Christianity's rightful influence on our government, please answer this question. Where does one find the greatest amount of religious freedom? Is it in Western countries where Christianity has had its greatest and longest influence? Or is it in countries where Christianity has had little or no influence, like Iran or North Korea? Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came over to America in the early 1800s. Basically, the French government sent him over to say, hey, why did America's revolution work and ours didn't? Ours devolved into the Reign of Terror, and then Napoleon, a dictator, came, and we can't seem to get it right. Why did America get it right? He published a book based on his journeys in America. It's called Democracy in America, and he published it in 1831. And he said this, quote, Americans combine the notions of Christianity and liberty so intimately that it's impossible for them to conceive of one without the other. One reference I would strongly suggest is a book called Original Intent by David Barton. It's very detailed, it's heavily footnoted. And his website is wallbuilders.com, and so I highly recommend that. In terms of the American philosophy of government, the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. The U.S. Constitution was written in the late 1780s. And on your handouts, I give a list or a table of where the Founding Fathers quoted from when they wrote these documents. By far, the source they quoted from the most in both the Declaration of Independence and in the U.S. Constitution is the Bible, by far. They also quote Enlightenment writers, but it's usually only those Enlightenment writers that were the more conservative Enlightenment writers. But even so, the Bible is used as a primary source, much more so than the Enlightenment writers. But like I say, the Enlightenment writers they used were more of the Christian-based thinkers like Montesquieu, Blackstone, Locke, Puffendorf, with the remaining few who were not Christian writers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and even those people they quoted like only 1 or 2% of the time. Blackstone was an English attorney and author and a Christian who wrote the book Commentaries on the Law, and that was the manual for every American college, law college, for over a century. In fact, his contribution that they used is in the preamble of our Declaration when it says, when in the course of human events, and then when he says, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, some people have said, well, the law of nature and nature's God, that's kind of amorphous. It's kind of a deistic thing. No, all you have to do is read Blackstone to know that he was talking about the God of the Bible. While John Locke may not have been an evangelical Christian, he drew heavily on the Bible in developing his political theories. In fact, in his first treatise on government, he cited the Bible 1,349 times. And in the second time he cited, which was much smaller, he cited it 157 times. Not surprisingly, Locke was a theologian whose two major books were The Reasonableness of Christianity, published in 1696, and A Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity. So yes, America was based on the general principles of Christianity, but we've never been a Christian nation in terms of a theocracy like Iran is today, that's run by religious leaders. And I don't know of any Christian that says we should be that. So when we say America was founded on Christian principles, that's what we mean. Or when we say America, some people say that America was a Christian nation, but we're not now. That's what they mean. They don't mean that we were a theocracy, because nobody really believes we were. But I have to say, in the latter part of the 20th century, we have gotten way away from that. And some of the Supreme Court decisions have, the founders would turn over in their graves. Next, I'd like to talk about labor and economic freedom. How do we view work today? What about physical labor, like an electrician or a carpenter or an auto line worker? Believe it or not, in the ancient world, they had an extremely low view of physical labor. They thought, especially in the Greco-Roman world, they thought it was only suitable for slaves and the lower class people. At one time, Athens had 5 times as many slaves as citizens. The Roman philosopher Cicero said, quote, "Vulgar are the means of livelihood of all hired workers whom we pay for mere manual labor," end quote. Wow. Well, again, I wish we had learned that in history when we studied the Greco-Roman culture. Christians assigned work honor and dignity for 3 reasons. 1, Jesus was a carpenter. That was a lowly profession back then. 2, Paul earned a living from a trade. He was a tent maker. And 3, Christians believed 2 Thessalonians 3:10 and Luke 10:7. Hence, Christians saw work as a calling that was under the lordship of Christ. If you take a look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, it reads this, "And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." And then in verse 23 and 24, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving." That was a radical message in the Greco-Roman world. This view of work being honorable set them apart from the prevailing view. As a result, it also earned them derision. Why? Because they prospered economically as a result of their strong work ethic. In fact, in today's world, it's simply assumed that all workers deserve a fair wage for their work. If you take a look at Luke chapter 10, verse 7, he says this, "Stay therefore eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages." Until the Christian view of work came to be, this wasn't true at all, as the majority of residents worked as slaves or lower class people. As a result, there wasn't much of a middle class in the Greco-Roman world. The middle class today arose due to the Christian work ethic, especially the Puritan work ethic of the 1600s. The Christian work ethic has been rightly credited with greatly reducing poverty, and its byproduct, disease. As a result, the poor in America are much, much richer than most of the world. Now, as an example of this, after World War II, Japan intentionally adopted Western economic and industrial values that were largely the product of the Christian work ethic. But once the effects of a cause have become operative, they can be utilized apart from the original cause. So the Japanese looked at America and they said, wow, their productive capacity just overwhelmed us. We're going to use that. We're just not going to include the Christian part. And they've used it quite effectively. Another thing I'd like to look at is property rights and individual freedom. Now, for the most part, private property rights for the common man, again, were non-existent in the Greco-Roman world. Again, if you were the rich and elite, or if you were a high-ranking military officer, that was a different story. But for the vast majority of people, there were no property rights. Private property rights are vital to people's freedoms. The two can't be separated. Where there are no private property rights, there usually are very little human or civil rights. A good example of that is in communist countries. If you take a look at one of the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, it says, "You shall not steal." And then in verse 17 it says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Well, there's a reason for that. Those commandments assume, or that commandment assumes that a person has the right and the freedom to acquire, retain, and sell his property at his own discretion. Matthew chapter 20, verse 15 says this, and this is Jesus talking, "Don't I have the right to do with what I want with my own money? Or are you generous, or are you envious because I'm generous?" Yes, Jesus did speak against the over-attachment to material things. Very true. But he never spoke to their exclusion. Capitalism, or more accurately, free markets or free enterprise, is a byproduct of Christianity's value on spiritual freedom as applied to economic life and activities. You know, I often wondered why totalitarian regimes don't like Christianity. Christianity teaches you to be a good citizen, to obey the government where it doesn't disagree with what God says. And, you know, so I wondered, why do they outlaw Christianity? Guess why? Because the spiritual freedom we have in Christ will eventually translate over into economic freedom. In countries where the free market is not permitted to exist, the gap between the rich and the poor is actually the widest. If you go back to when the Soviet Union was in existence, the gap between the rich and the poor in the Soviet Union was far greater than it is here in America. Now, yes, there are drawbacks to free market. Because of mankind's fallen nature, we may need to place some barriers on the system. One good example was the Standard Oil Corporation in the early 1900s. They became so powerful they were running any other competitor out of business because they would lower the price of gas where a competitor was, and then when they drove them out of business, they raised it, and then they lowered it in another place. Also, it's a good idea to have tax deductions for charitable contributions. But you don't want to have too many restrictions. Another aspect of our fallen nature is, even here in America, the big difference between a CEO's salary and that of the average worker. Greed works against any economic system. If you take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, it says, "For the love of money," it doesn't say that money is the root of all evil, it says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Again, is it coincidence that the greatest amount of freedom and economic prosperity exist in countries where Christianity has had a dominant presence? As a Jewish rabbi, Daniel Laban, said, it's no accident that a capital market has never arisen indigenously in any non-Christian country. And it's only very recently, in the last generation, where China, a communist country, has realized, hey, communist economics don't work, and so they are starting to free up their economy. They're a long way from a free market economy, but as they are, they're also having to contend with the fact that people now want individual freedom. But by giving dignity to work and accenting the spirit of individual freedom, Christianity has produced profound economic effects. And they're still going on. Now again, the more restrictions we put on it, in a sense, the worse it's going to be. It's not going to perform as well, but we need to have some restrictions because of our sinful fallen nature. Well, that's about it for this week. We'll see you next week.